Hi, I'm Nate Knapper, founder and CEO of the Joseph Project. As an attorney and a federal law enforcement officer, I've seen human trafficking up close. And this is a form of modern-day slavery that is not confined to some faraway overseas location. It is a crime that is perpetrated right here in the United States, in the cities and towns where you and I live and work and call home. And while human trafficking has become more common through the years, I think that there are also a variety of misconceptions that continue to persist. And so this training session is designed to offer a foundational understanding and a realistic perspective of domestic human trafficking. And I think that that perspective is so important, especially for attorneys who are going to be representing survivors of human trafficking on a pro bono basis. Because to the extent that we can understand a problem more comprehensively, as well as the dynamics that surround that problem, we'll be better postured to confront it in the most effective way and ultimately to achieve the legal results that we're hoping to achieve. So, it's a straightforward presentation. I've broken it up into two primary sections. The first section is going to talk about the crime of human trafficking. We're going to set forth a very basic definition of the crime, talk about some misconceptions that are out there, and then follow up with a few considerations that may be appropriate to your representation of a survivor. From there, we'll transition into section 2, which is a discussion of the consequences of human trafficking, especially as it relates to the legal arena. So first, the crime of human trafficking. It's important to set forth a basic definition so that we know what it is that we're talking about. Human trafficking can be understood as the commercial exploitation of another person for sex or labor services through force, fraud, or coercion. So the commercial exploitation of another person for sex or labor services through force, fraud, or coercion. So breaking that definition down into its component parts, I want to address the topic of commercial exploitation first. So when you have a human trafficking situation, you are talking about a monetary transaction that is occurring. There is a commercial component to the concept of human trafficking. Exploiters, sometimes commonly referred to as pimps, they ultimately do what they do to make a profit, to make money for themselves. And so when you have that understanding of trafficking as commercial exploitation, it becomes much easier to understand why you don't have to move someone from point A to point B in order to traffic them. And I think that this is a big misconception that needs to be dispelled, because so oftentimes we think about trafficking as a problem that originates when someone is forcibly kidnapped from one location and then taken to and exploited at another location. That can happen, and it does happen, and we've seen it before, but far and away, it is not the most common way that trafficking is perpetuated today. When you are talking about the movement, the illegal movement of a person from point A to point B, you are more likely invoking the concept of human smuggling. Trafficking is a crime of exploitation and is thus something different. You can exploit somebody for profit within the confines of your own home, within your vehicle, within a local hotel or motel. You do not have to move someone across a state or an international border in order to traffic them. And so I think that that is a very important distinction to make because of how we commonly tend to think of the way that trafficking is most frequently perpetuated. It doesn't necessarily have to involve the forcible kidnapping and movement of a person from here to there. Also, in our definition, we made the distinction between sex and labor services. And I think that within the context of trafficking-related conversations, it is common to discuss and bifurcate the concept into discussions of sex and labor. People have generally an understanding of sex trafficking. This is the most common form of trafficking that people tend to understand. But again, here, it's important to draw a distinction between trafficking and prostitution, because there is a difference between the two, and they tend to get conflated. So, in a prostitution situation, what you have is a scenario where there is somebody who you might identify as a sex worker, and then you have another second party who's going to be the buyer, and you have a sex for money arrangement that is being conducted. Now, once the transaction occurs, what you have is a situation where the sex worker is the one profiting from the transaction that's taken place. Again, trafficking is a crime of exploitation, and so that is something different. Not only would you have in this situation a sex worker and a buyer, but then you would have a third party, an embedded third party who is profiting based on the sex services that are being rendered, often while the person who is rendering the services profits very little or in no way at all. So that's the distinction between human trafficking and prostitution. And again, I think it's an important one to draw. The same concept would carry over into the discussion regarding labor trafficking. So what you have in a labor trafficking context is a situation where you have an exploiter who is taking advantage of another person for their manual labor. And we have seen this in a variety of contexts. It could take place as a domestic servitude situation where somebody is being exploited within the confines of a private home. It's also been known to happen in agricultural settings. Perhaps you have the owner of a farm who is exploiting and taking advantage of a farmhand, profiting while that person derives no profit from the manual labor that they are exerting. We've also seen it take place in hotels and motels, restaurants, and massage parlors. So the idea is the same. You have an embedded third party who is taking advantage of the labor services of another person, oftentimes while that person derives little or no benefit from the services that they are delivering. So how is this exploitation perpetuated? Well, we said in our definition that it's done in three primary ways: through force, fraud, or coercion. So those are commonly understood to be the three pillars of the human trafficking definition. So it's useful to devote some time to each concept in turn. Force is probably the most common form of control and the one that people tend to equate the most with human trafficking situations. So when an exploiter is using force to control a victim, what they are doing is they're using physical violence. And so we've seen examples of exploiters who have physically assaulted their victims using either their fists or some other kind of blunt force object. We have seen exploiters burn survivors with cigarettes, perfectly cylindrical burn marks up and down their arms to get them to comply with the directives that the exploiter wants them to accomplish. We have seen instances of sexual assault or rape. We've also seen people who have been confined to a specific area and sometimes even tortured in some ways in order to induce their compliance. So force is a particularly heinous but also a very common mechanism that exploiters use to control their victims. Similarly, fraud is a concept that is easy for people to understand. So fraud is simply misleading somebody into thinking that something is true when in fact it's not. And exploiters do this a lot with their victims. They will pitch them promises of a better life, where they promise them, for example, a new home, or a new set of clothing, or a new vehicle, or any of the common everyday entrapments that might induce somebody to go along with the lie. The problem is that once the victim has gone in and bought into the lie, the reality of the situation is often far different from what was initially pitched to them. And by that time, they're in too deep and they can't extract themselves from the danger that they find themselves in. So fraud is a very common mechanism of control that exploiters frequently use in order to induce the compliance of their victims. Finally, you have coercion, and coercion is such an important concept to discuss within the context of human trafficking because it's a very common means by which exploiters control their victims. And you really can't talk about coercion without discussing the interplay of human trafficking and drug abuse because the two are so closely related together. Coercion is often perpetrated by means of drug use. We would call this drug-based coercion. And the idea is relatively straightforward. In this, you have an exploiter who identifies somebody who is either already addicted to drugs or who has a vulnerability to become addicted to drugs. And the idea is that they would methodically and continuously feed this person addictive substances so that they, once again, develop and deepen into an addiction, ultimately becoming dependent upon those substances. And from there, it becomes very simple for the exploiter to exercise control over them because they have little or no choice but to do what the person wants them to do. This is such a common means of control that some states have actually begun saying that if you are controlling or facilitating another person's access to a controlled substance for other than legitimate medical purposes, you are by definition coercing them for purposes of human trafficking. So it's that common that states have started to impose those definitions on the concept of coercion. And anecdotally, in my experience, I can say definitively that this is the most common form of control that I have seen exploiters exert over the people that they ultimately end up victimizing. Drug dependency is not the only way that traffickers coerce their victims, however. They also threaten abuse of the legal process. So if there's a foreign national involved, for example, it is common for traffickers to threaten them by saying, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to report you to the immigration authorities and then you'll be deported, and what will happen to you then? It's common for traffickers to make such threats. It's also common for traffickers to threaten members of a potential victim's family, either through threats of death or great bodily harm. These are means of coercion that traffickers use to exercise control over those they ultimately exploit. So that's a basic definition of human trafficking. Once again, the commercial exploitation of another person for sex or labor services through force, fraud, or coercion. Now, a couple of follow-up considerations related to that line of discussion. Number one, you might be wondering, well, who are the victims of this crime? And as a starting point for answering that question, I don't find it as helpful to define the victims according to a specific demographic set or according to a particular geographic area. Rather, I find it more useful to discuss this answer in the context of vulnerability. So at the Joseph Project, we say that vulnerability leads to victimization. So in other words, the higher the level of vulnerability, the greater the chance of victimization. And when you're talking about vulnerability, what we're really saying are that people are exposed to certain vulnerability factors that increase their level of desperation. And these are things that we see around us all the time. There are things like poverty, things like broken homes. Perhaps people have run away from home and they're not under the confines of a protective family structure anymore. We've already discussed the concept of drug use at length. These are all factors that increase people's level of desperation and thus make them more susceptible to victimization. A second consideration worth thinking about is, how are victims being recruited? And the answer is straightforward: online. The internet, and especially social media applications, are the primary means by which exploiters are spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, and ultimately exploiting their victims today. And so, while this session is not designed to be a discussion of online safety, we certainly always want to encourage people to exercise the appropriate caution when they navigate the online space, especially if you are a parent or a guardian of young children. So that's a broad overview of the crime of human trafficking, the definition, clarifying a few misconceptions, and following up with some practical considerations. From here, I want to transition the conversation and talk about the consequences of human trafficking, and specifically the consequences that arise in the legal arena when exploitation occurs. At the Joseph Project, we call this the legal collateral damage associated with human trafficking. So these are those issues that survivors encounter as a result of their exploitation that they must resolve in order to move forward into a brighter future in any sort of meaningful way. And of course, the legal needs of human trafficking survivors are often as unique as the survivors who have them. But generally speaking, they fall into three broad categories. The first category is criminal record relief. So it is very common that when survivors leave the circumstances of their exploitation, they are leaving those circumstances with a criminal record. Now, these are charges and convictions that they have accumulated through the force, the fraud, and the coercion to which they have been subjected. And so when they acquire these convictions, it's important that they obtain criminal record relief from competent counsel who are able to, for example, help them expunge those things from their records or set them aside. We have even had examples at the Joseph Project where we have assisted survivors in preparing applications for pardon based on offenses that they wish to clear from their record that they have participated in the past. A second category is family law. At the Joseph Project, we have also seen circumstances where families have been broken apart by trafficking situations, parents separated from their children, for example. We've also seen the unfortunate circumstance where one family member is trafficking another family member. So when these kinds of things happen, it invokes a whole host of family law considerations, things like child custody and child support, considerations related to divorce and alimony, all kinds of issues that fall under the family law umbrella that survivors need to resolve in order to move forward in a more productive manner. Finally, you have immigration-related obstacles. And this is, of course, most common when you have a foreign national involved in the exploitation at issue. So, when a person is in the country illegally and they're being exploited by somebody in a domestic situation, there are various mechanisms of legal relief that those survivors can take advantage of in order to stay in the United States legally, start to work, and start to rebuild their lives in a more productive manner. However, the immigration system tends to be very complex, and it's most useful if those survivors can take advantage of those mechanisms with the assistance of skilled legal counsel. So immigration-related challenges represent a huge area of legal need for survivors, especially when a foreign national is involved. And these legal needs are exactly why the Joseph Project exists. We are here to confront the legal collateral damage associated with human trafficking situations. And the mission is straightforward. It's to connect survivors of human trafficking with skilled pro bono legal counsel. And as a legal first responder, you are a critical part of that network, that justice delivery system that we are seeking to extend to survivors who need it most. So on behalf of our entire organization, thank you so much for choosing to be a legal first responder. Thank you for leveraging your legal education and your expertise on behalf of those in need. We're going to have some contact information on the screen. If there is anything that the Joseph Project can do to support your representation of a survivor, please don't hesitate to contact us. We'd love to leverage our own resources to ensure that you are successful and that ultimately survivors achieve the victories that they are so deserving of. So thank you once again for your support, and we look forward to working with you.